I only needed shelter, but that old barrel sounded like it remembered my family.
She was 23 and homeless. No room, no paycheck, no working bank card, just a canvas tool roll and $4 she had saved from the lining of her winter coat, and with that $4, she bought an abandoned cooperage sagging above Beargrass Creek in Jefferson County, Kentucky, where county maps had stopped naming it in 1978. The north wall leaned 6 inches outward. Rain came through 3 breaks in the roof. Jefferson County condemned it on October 14, 2022, and marked it for demolition the following spring. Yet inside the thickest iron hoop of a giant display barrel lay a soldered zinc tube, unopened for generations, holding money, a family hammer, and a formula no distillery had ever possessed. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hazel Marie Mercer had been bracing her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in a narrow rental house near Shively, where trucks shook the window glass before dawn and every cupboard door had to be lifted before it would close. By 9, she knew how to patch a hem, stretch soup through Thursday, and listen from the hallway when adults lowered their voices over bills. Her mother, Elaine, could make a clean blouse look like security. She worked reception desks, changed churches whenever gossip drew too near, and kept every overdue notice beneath the flower bin. Affection came as practical instruction. Stand straight, answer clearly, never let anyone see you count your money twice. The exception was Elaine's father, Amos Mercer, a retired cooper with 2 bent fingers and oak dust permanently settled in the seams of his hands. Every Saturday he took Hazel to a one-room shed behind his house in Okolona. He let her sweep first, then showed her how white oak split true only when the wedge followed the medullary rays. She held staves against a sunken barrel form while he worked a draw-knife toward his apron, shaving each inner face until the wood answered with a thin, even curl. At noon they ate cold biscuits on an upturned bucket. Afterward he warmed the unfinished barrel over a small fire, wetting the outside with a rag while the heat drew the staves inward. Hazel turned the windlass one careful click at a time. Fire does not ruin honest wood, Amos told her. It shows the grain what shape it can bear. She remembered the sentence whenever pain demanded movement instead of explanation. He died in February 2015. After a stroke left his workshop silent for 11 days. By the time Hazel and Elaine reached the property, the shed had been emptied by an estate company. The draw knives, crozes, hoop drivers, patterns, and Amos's engraved Cooper's hammer had vanished into unlabeled auction lots. Elaine signed the release without reading it twice. 8 years later, Hazel worked accounts payable for Bexler Beverage Logistics in downtown Louisville under a director named Warren Pike. He wore pale shirts without wrinkles and spoke softly enough that everyone leaned toward him. He approved payroll from a glass office, locked filing cabinets during lunch, and corrected harmless mistakes in front of whole departments. On the final Friday, his office was empty, the payroll reserve was gone, and federal investigators were waiting beside the elevators. Warren had boarded a flight before sunrise. Hazel's account was frozen during the inquiry because her employee credentials had been used on transfers she had never seen. Her lease ended 9 days later on May 31, 2023. The landlord set her belongings beside the curb in 2 black bags and 1 dented sewing tin. Elaine arrived in a beige sedan, lowered the passenger window, and looked past Hazel toward the building. "You cannot come home," your stepfather said. "No." Exactly 8 words. Hazel placed the sewing tin inside 1 bag and waited for her mother to open the door. Elaine gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Then the light changed at the corner, though no car stood behind her, and she drove away without turning her head. For 6 weeks, Hazel moved south and east through the city by bus and on foot. She slept 2 nights beneath the covered picnic shelter at Iroquois Park, 4 in the women's waiting room at the Greyhound station, until a guard recognized her coat, and 1 rain-heavy week in the upper level of a parking garage near Market Street. She washed in library sinks and folded the same blouse beneath her head to keep its collar clean. $43 became $28 after bus fare, then $17 after bread, apples, and a packet of safety pins. When it reached 9, she stopped riding. At 6, she crossed the Ohio River on the pedestrian path and slept behind a church in Jeffersonville. She spent $1 on coffee because the cup allowed her to remain indoors until morning. On July 12th, she sat beneath a slow ceiling fan in the Louisville Free Public Library and searched county surplus notices on a public computer. Most listings required sealed bids, deposits, or proof of insurance. Near the bottom of a scanned legal page, one line had been underlined in blue pencil. Abandoned Cooperage, structure only, $4 quitclaim, Buer assumes all liability. Applications closed at 4. The word Cooperage held her still. She touched the canvas tool roll at her feet, though it contained only pliers, a kitchen knife, and Amos's folding rule. The clock above the reference desk showed 2:17. She printed the page for 10 cents, leaving $3.90 in her pocket, then asked the librarian which bus ran nearest to the county clerk's office. Before the library doors had finished closing behind her, Hazel was already walking toward the last property nobody else wanted. Hazel reached the clerk's office with 7 minutes left before closing and bought the Cooperage before anyone had time to persuade her otherwise. The journey to claim it began the following morning on a county bus that carried her east past brick warehouses, bourbon yards, and low fields silvered by rain. The driver let her off near Taylorsville Road, 11 miles from the deed coordinates. She walked 9 before dark, slept beneath loose hay in an open tobacco barn, and woke at 4:20 a.m. to 38 degrees and mice moving below her boots. By sunrise, the final 2 miles had turned her shoes black with mud. The nearest settlement was called Ashby Cross, though it occupied little more than a bend. Hazel passed Dana Hardware, its windows crowded with stovepipe and hose, the Blue Hen Cafe, Mercer's Feed and Seed, Boyd's Chapel, and Rusk Auto Repair, where a man in coveralls listened to an engine with one palm on the hood. The county clerk's branch office occupied the former Ashby Cross Bank, a limestone room with barred teller windows still set into one wall. Behind the counter, a woman sorted deeds into shallow trays. A silver pencil crossed the knot of her hair. Her brass plate read MRS, Edith Harlow, Deputy Clerk. Mrs. Harlow studied Hazel's mud-dark shoes and the notice in her hand. You understand the property has no utilities? Yes, ma'am. You understand the roof has failed? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not reimburse repairs? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition remains authorized unless the structure is stabilized before March? Yes, ma'am. The clerk waited, perhaps expecting youth to correct itself. Then she opened a ledger smelling of dust and carbon paper. Hazel placed 4 worn dollars on the counter. Mrs. Harlow counted them once, spread them across the deed, and brought down a brass stamp with a hard official blow. Old Shepherdsville Road, she said. Past the quarry turn, left at the abandoned water tower, then Cooper Lane until the pavement ends. Beyond the second creek crossing, she began sliding the deed beneath the grill, then stopped. Mercer. Your grandfather was Amos Mercer. Hazel's hand remained open. Yes. Mrs. Harlow removed her glasses. Amos had repaired cider barrels for her father and later made small charred kegs for distillers who refused machine-cut staves. He had asked for years about buying this same cooperage, but unpaid taxes and an inheritance dispute had trapped the title. By the time the county cleared it, he had been dead nearly 8 years. He came every January, she said, carried a black notebook and asked whether the Mercer place had been released. The Mercer place? That was his name for it. The deed listed Silas Varden, not Mercer? Mrs. Harlow searched an older card index, found nothing more, and returned the papers with directions written in blue ink. Before Hazel left, the clerk placed one of the $4 in the narrow center drawer of her desk rather than the cash box. I want to remember what this cost. Cooper Lane narrowed from asphalt to gravel, then to two pale tracks divided by weeds. A neighbour named Mr. Tully watched from a rusted tractor. He wore one red glove and lifted it without speaking. His brindled dog followed Hazel to the fence corner, sneezed at her canvas roll and turned back. Beyond the next rise, walnut trees leaned across the road, releasing a bitter green scent in the afternoon heat. The cooperage emerged between them. It was a timber-framed shed about 30 feet wide and 60 long, sided in weathered poplar over a limestone foundation. Rusted standing seam metal covered most of the roof, though 3 sections had peeled upward. A brick chimney rose from the eastern slope with its top courses missing. Above the double doors hung a sign whose remaining letters read Varden-Tyke Coopers. Moss filled the lower iron hoops stacked against the wall. The county key entered the padlock, but the lock opened only after Hazel struck it twice against the staple. The right door dragged across the floor, releasing cold air scented with wet oak, soot mouse nesting, and whiskey left in an empty glass. Dust turned in the daylight. Her palm met the rough edge of a bench, and a loose hoop rolled in the dark with a low metallic complaint. The front room held a scarred counter, a cast-iron stove, and shelves bowed under damp ledgers. Rain had blackened the floorboards near the north wall. In back stood shaving horses, barrel forms and curved staves beneath old canvas. Hazel lifted one, mould powdered her fingertips. But the heartwood remained firm. She struck it against the bench. The note was clear. Toward evening she found the well pump frozen at the handle, and an outhouse leaning behind blackberry canes. There would be no water that night. She ate the heel of yesterday's bread, wrapped herself in her coat, and laid flattened barrel sacks across the driest floor. Wind entered through the roof and moved along the rafters like a broom in another room. Still, the door locked from the inside. Hazel placed Amos's folding rule beside her head and watched moonlight settle across the giant display barrel at the far end. Its lowest hoop was thicker than the others. Along the iron ran a narrow raised seam where no seam should have been. The house had not forgotten her. It had only been waiting. For the first 3 days, Hazel left the giant barrel untouched. The well demanded attention first. She removed the pump head, found the leather cup hardened like old bark, soaked it in warm water borrowed from the cafe, and packed the cylinder with clean grease. On the 12th stroke, rust-coloured water coughed into the trough. By afternoon it ran clear enough to wash with, though she boiled every cup she drank. The outhouse took half a day. She straightened its door with a stone beneath one hinge and cleared blackberry runners from the path. At night she learned the floor by sound, a high complaint near the counter, 2 hollow boards beside the stove, and one deep creak outside the workroom that seemed to answer a footstep after she had already stopped. On the 4th morning, she walked back to Danner Hardware. The owner stood behind the counter beneath rows of keys and stove gaskets. His name was Frank Danner, and one side of his white moustache had been singed short as though fire had once interrupted breakfast. The store smelled of linseed oil, fertilizer, and the faint mineral chill of iron kept indoors. Hazel placed her remaining coins on the counter and asked what they could buy. Frank looked at the coins, then at the folding rule protruding from her coat pocket. "Amos Mercer's?" She nodded. He opened a narrow account book. "I can carry you 30 days. I may need longer. Then do not waste anything." He wrote Hazel Mercer, Cooperage at the top of a page and pushed across a stained copy of Home Repairs for Farm and Workshop. Its spine had been reinforced with black tape. "Free," he said. "Nobody reads the chimney chapter until smoke teaches it." She bought a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $8.75, 20 feet of rope for $3.20, a tin of stove cement for $4.60, work gloves for $2.10, and 2 pounds of cut nails for $3.85. Frank added a used bucket without writing it down. The chimney chapter took her 2 readings and 1 cold hour on the roof to understand. She tied the brush between 2 lengths of rope, fed one line down the flue, and worked it from above while the other line ran through the stove opening below. Each pull released a dry shower of soot. The first hour brought flakes, the second brought hard black scales of creosote, glossy as beetle wings. Twice the brush lodged where the flue narrowed, and she had to reverse the rope, climb down, and strike the masonry with the wooden handle of a hammer. She covered the stove opening with a wet sack, but soot still escaped along the floor and darkened the sweat at her temples. After 4 hours the brush passed without catching. Hazel swept 3 buckets of debris from the firebox, sealed a cracked collar with stove cement, and waited until evening for it to skin over. The first fire began with walnut twigs, 2 pine shavings, and 1 split stave too damaged to save. Smoke hovered near the stove door, then lifted and disappeared into the flue. Outside, a thin grey thread rose above the broken chimney. Hazel stood in the yard until she was certain it would keep rising. That night she heated beans in a dented saucepan and toasted bread directly on the stove lid. The room smelled of iron, smoke, and food that belonged to her. She ate sitting on the floor, holding the warm bowl with both hands. Only then did she begin the workroom. She opened the shutters and carried each useful object into a strip of daylight, a Cooper's jointer plane nearly 5 feet long, its blade furred with rust, 2 shaving horses with cracked leather straps, a windlass rope stiff from age, a set of hollowing knives ground thinner than modern steel, 3 wooden truss hoops, a charred barrel head marked with concentric test burns, and a stave compass whose brass points still opened smoothly. Beneath the central bench she found white oak billets stacked off the floor on stone blocks. The outer pieces had softened, but several at the centre rang clean when struck. The giant display barrel occupied the rear corner. It stood taller than Hazel's shoulder and had never been meant to hold liquid. Its staves were too wide, its head too heavily carved. The lowest iron hoop, however, had been forged from stock almost twice as thick as the others. Hazel tapped each hoop with Frank's small ball-peen hammer. The upper bands answered sharply. The lowest gave a dull, shortened note near the raised seam. She tapped again, moving 1 inch at a time. Clear. 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 Then dead. The barrel also leaned toward that section when she balanced it on 2 wood strips. Something inside the hoop altered its weight. She cleaned the iron with oil and burlap until a narrow solder line appeared beneath the rust. It did not belong to the hoop itself. A zinc tube had been rolled along the inner curve and painted black to disappear against the metal. One end vanished beneath a circular cedar disc set into the barrel's false bottom. Hazel knelt and tested the disc with her knife. It had no visible screws. At its centre was a shallow mark shaped like a compass rose, worn almost smooth by dust. She pressed it with her thumb. Nothing moved. The stave compass fit the mark. When she inserted 1 brass point and turned the tool, the cedar disc rotated a 1/4 turn. A spring clicked inside the barrel. The disc rose enough for her fingernails to catch its edge. She lifted it slowly. The compartment beneath was lined with waxed cloth. Hazel removed the first bundle and set it on the bench before reaching for another. There were 4 in all, tied separately with cotton tape gone brown at the knots. The first held 3 edge tools wrapped in oiled wool, a narrow crow's, a backing knife, and a draw knife with applewood handles polished by long use. The second contained 6/4 sawn white oak samples, each marked in pencil with a charring time and temperature. The third was heavier. Inside lay a Cooper's hammer, its head dark and square, its handle stamped Amos Mercer beneath an older name nearly worn away. Hazel sat down before opening the final package. It was a rectangular tin box sealed around the lid with red wax. The wax broke beneath the kitchen knife. Inside rested a folded letter, a black notebook, and packets of currency bound with linen thread. She did not touch the letter. The notes came first, 10s, 20s, and 50s, many issued before she was born, lay flat between sheets of onion paper. Beneath them were cloth rolls of coins. She counted on the workbench, arranging everything into exact rows: Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half dollars, Mercury dimes, and Indian head cents worn smooth at the cheek. The first count came to $31,796.42. Hazel counted again. A $half had lodged in a fold of cloth, bringing the total to $31,796.92. Beneath it lay a tarnished bronze medal on a faded ribbon, a World War I victory medal, dated 1919 along its edge, with a small battle clasp darkened almost black. The notebook contained columns, temperatures, toast times, and drawings of flame height beneath barrel shells. One page listed a sequence of 40 seconds at high flame, 12 minutes of low toast, then a cooling interval measured not by a clock but by the scent changing from smoke to vanilla. Hazel closed it before reading further. By then the light had thinned to blue. She carried the unopened letter outside and sat beside Beargrass Creek, where the water moved around limestone shelves with a sound too steady to hurry. Frogs began in the reeds. She placed the letter on her knee, held it there until the paper cooled beneath her palm, then returned it to the tin. Some things look like small gestures and turn out to be everything. At dawn, Hazel carried the tin box to the front room and set it beside the stove. The folded pages were cream-coloured, thin at the creases, and covered in a narrow right-leaning hand. She knew the handwriting before she reached the signature. Amos had written her birthday cards in the same deliberate slant, leaving a little more space before every capital letter. She unfolded the first page. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has reached your hands, then you have opened the false bottom properly and have not damaged the hoop to satisfy your hurry. That tells me something useful about you. My name is Amos Elijah Mercer. Doctor? Leonard Weiss at Jewish Hospital in Louisville told me on September 8th, 2014, that the weakness in my left hand came from an inoperable cerebral aneurysm. He could not say whether I had months or years. I have decided to prepare for either. Our family trade began with Silas Mercer, who learned tight coopering near Lexington in 1847 and opened a yard outside Bardstown in 1852. His son Josiah moved the work to Jefferson County in 1881. Josiah's daughter Ruth Mercer Varden kept the books, cut heads, and ran this shop after her husband died in 1906. Her son Elias continued until August 17, 1979. The exact day the trade closed, I was Elias's nephew and his last apprentice. For more than 30 years, no Mercer worked this floor. Elias lost his older brother Thomas in France during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. The medal in the box belonged to him. Ruth kept it wrapped beside the toast records because she said grief and work both had to be handled with clean hands. The notebook contains what remains of our method. Use quarter-sawn white oak and reject any stave that crosses the grain. Air season no less than 18 months. Warm the shell gradually to 325 degrees before tightening the final truss hoop. For the vanilla toast, hold between 390 and 410 degrees for 12 minutes, then char 40 seconds with the flame moving, never fixed. Rest one toasted stave for every 9 plain staves when you test a new barrel. Exactness matters more than force. The money came from small repairs, saved wages, and barrels made quietly after the shop closed. It is not payment for being related to us. Blood has wasted many good inheritances. The person who cleans the tools, studies the wood, and leaves honest work for another has earned a place in this line. If you keep none of it, keep the hammer. It belongs with the hand willing to learn. Behind the back door you will find a limestone marker beneath the blackberry roots. Ruth carved it when Thomas did not come home. Light the old brass lamp for him once. That will be enough. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Amos Elijah Mercer. November 2, 2014. Hazel read the letter twice. The second time she moved one finger beneath each technical line as Amos had taught her to follow measurements. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, pressing each one flat with the heel of her hand. She did not wipe her face until a drop struck the notebook cover and began to darken the cloth. behind the back door. Blackberry canes had grown through a broken step. Hazel cut them away with the kitchen knife, working from the outside inward so the thorns would not close behind her. Beneath 2 inches of leaf mould, the blade struck stone. The marker was no higher than a loaf of bread. Weather had softened its corners, but the carved words remained. Thomas E. Mercer, 1994 to 1918. H made the wood hold. A small brass lamp had been wrapped with the medal beneath the currency. Hazel polished its burner with a strip of flour sack, filled the reservoir with kerosene from Frank's store account, and trimmed the blackened wick. At sunset she placed it on the limestone marker and touched a match to it. The flame bent once in the creek wind, then stood straight. She remained there until the first star appeared. On her walk back inside, Hazel began counting the people who had carried her farther than they knew, the librarian who had circled the last bus route in pencil, the station custodian who had left a clean towel beside the sink without asking questions, Mrs. Harlow who had kept $1 apart from the county cash, Frank Danner who had opened a credit ledger before Hazel could offer him certainty. None had rescued her. Each had simply moved one burden a few inches. Before this story continues, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they could not have known how badly you needed it. What was it? And do you still remember the person's face? Tell us in the comments. Quiet kindness deserves a place where it can be named. That night Hazel laid the draw knife, crows, Cooper's hammer, and folded letter beside her bedding. The brass lamp remained outside until its flame consumed the last of the kerosene. She slept with one hand resting on the hammer's applewood handle. Snow arrived on December 3rd, 6 inches by noon, flattening the blackberry canes and exposing every place where the roof had failed. Hazel read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the stove, then measured the building twice. 30 feet across, 60 along the ridge, with 2 shallow slopes, and nearly 1,200 square feet of damaged surface. Her calculation called for 38 bundles of shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and 22 pounds of roofing nails, allowing for waste she could not afford. Frank Danner delivered the first load in his pickup and handed her a roofing hatchet with a worn leather grip. My brother used this 40 years. A former roofer named Walter Boone came with him. He was 71, narrow through the shoulders, and missing the top joint of his left thumb. When Hazel asked his price, she removed a carpenter's pencil from behind his ear. Keep up. That will cover it. They worked 11 days. Walter taught her to sister the split rafters with straight lengths of pine bolted beyond the damaged wood. They snapped a chalk line across the felt so each course would run true, even where the old frame wandered. Hazel learned to set a nail with one tap, drive it with the second, and seat it flat with the third. That nail's proud. Hazel looked down. Pull it. By the 5th day, her shoulders burned before breakfast. By the 8th, freezing rain coated the ladder rungs, and they stopped only long enough to wrap them in burlap. Walter refused to let her hurry the ridge caps. Water remembers every careless inch, he said. They finished on December 14th. That night, sleet struck the new roof with a hard, dry sound. But no drop reached the floor. The chimney waited until January, when the upper bricks began shedding thin red flakes onto the roof. Mortar powdered beneath Hazel's thumb. Several bricks had spalled so deeply that their fired surfaces were gone, leaving soft interiors exposed to frost. Walter showed her how to remove only what had failed. She raked each joint to a depth of 3/4 of an inch, brushed away dust, and dampened the masonry before packing fresh mortar. Frank found hydraulic lime in the back storeroom. Hazel mixed 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, then added fire clay at a 4-to-1 ratio for the joints nearest the flue. For 3 weeks the temperature rarely rose above 28 degrees. She kept mortar beneath an old quilt beside the stove and worked in short intervals outside. Her bare hands gave better control than gloves, but they went numb every 15 minutes. She climbed down, warmed them around a tin cup, then returned before stiffness reached the joints. One morning, A repaired course shifted under its own weight. Hazel dismantled 2 hours of work and began again. Late on January 27th, she lit a test fire with dry walnut and a twist of newspaper. Smoke rose without hesitation. Outside, it drew cleanly through the rebuilt crown, straight into the pale winter sky. Walter watched from the yard and gave one small nod. The floors were white pine, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails that had darkened almost black. Hazel lifted each loose plank, numbered it in chalk, and repaired the joists below before setting it back into the same worn place. Frank rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She used it for 3 long days, moving with the grain and never letting the pad rest. The first pass at 80 grit removed soot, old wax and the grey surface raised by years of damp. 120 softened the scratches. 220 left the pine smooth without erasing every mark of boots, barrel hoops and dragged tools. The dust entered everything. Hazel found it in her sleeves, in the folds of the letter, and once inside the covered sugar tin. She sealed the room, wiped the boards with mineral spirits, and applied 3 thin coats of tung oil, rubbing each one until no glossy pools remained. The final coat required a 48-hour cure. Under oil, the floor shifted from dark honey toward mahogany. Nail heads appeared like small black constellations. There was one bad morning. Hazel woke before dawn, dressed, and carried the sander to the workroom, but she could not switch it on. She walked to the marsh beyond the creek and sat on a fallen walnut trunk. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, lifting 1 foot at a time as though the cold water required permission. Hazel watched it until afternoon and did no work that day. The next morning, she finished the final pass. 8 windows faced the lane and creek. 3 had no glass. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The last held one original hand-blown pane, dated 1788 in the lower sash, its surface wavering enough to bend the walnut trees outside. Hazel preserved it untouched. She removed the other sashes, numbered each mortise, and softened the old glazing with low heat before lifting the shards. Frank showed her how to roll DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms, press a continuous bed into the rabbet, set the pane without forcing it, then draw the putty knife at a clean angle toward the muntin. The sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. Hazel replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and securing it to the counterweight with a figure-8 knot. Twice a knot slipped and sent iron weights crashing into the wall cavity. On the 3rd attempt she learned to pull the knot tight against itself before lowering the weight. She spent 11 evenings scraping paint from the brass latches. Most were mismatched, but all could be made to close. On the final window, Hazel pressed the last line of putty smooth and raised the sash with both hands. It balanced halfway, neither falling nor resisting. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch and turned its black-capped head toward the room. Hazel stood very still until it flew. The plaster failed 3 times beside the chimney. The old walls were horsehair plaster laid over hand-split oak lath, and every surviving section carried the shallow ridges of a trowel drawn by someone long dead. Hazel tried modern patching compound first. It cracked overnight. The 2nd patch separated at the edge. The 3rd sagged before noon and fell in one grey sheet. Frank brought an old feed sack from his storeroom. Inside was clean horsehair saved by his father for mortar work. Hazel mixed lime plaster until it held a ridge combed in the hair and pressed a scored scratch coat through the lath. After it stiffened, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it untouched for 72 hours. The finish coat was 1/8 of an inch, worked thin with a damp steel trowel. The new surface did not hide the old wall. It joined it. Hazel ran her palm over the final patch. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Hale from the Blue Hen Café began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was broad through the shoulders, wore red-framed glasses, and folded every bag twice at the top. Inside were biscuits, soup jars, or ends of pie that could not be sold the next day. Hazel carried the first empty jars back and placed coins beside the register. Doris pushed them away with 2 fingers. In candles when the shop reopens, the next week, a boy named Caleb Mercer arrived on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, all knees and elbows, with a pale scar cutting one eyebrow. Without asking, she began breaking storm-fallen walnut into stove lengths. Hazel offered him $2. He shook his head and reset the next piece on the block. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all he gave her. Reverend Boyd passed the lane each morning on his walk to the chapel. He wore a black coat polished white at both cuffs and tipped his hat whether Hazel stood outside or not. On the coldest February morning, he stopped beside the chimney, placed one hand against the repaired brick, and said, "Let the work endure." Then he continued down the road. Hazel postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door lay beneath a trap panel behind the workbench. Below it, 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot room with a fieldstone floor and walls darkened by ground moisture. She carried the brass lamp first, then a broom, then a length of rope tied around her waist in case one step gave way. None did. At the center of the floor rested a dressed granite slab cut more carefully than the surrounding stones. A craft mark had been carved into its face, a barrel hoop crossed by a draw knife. Hazel cleaned the grooves with a soft brush, but she did not try to lift it. Some doors announced themselves before a person was ready to open them. Under the 3rd step, her fingers touched a small oak box wedged between stone and timber. The lid had swollen shut. She warmed it beside the stove and worked it free with a thin knife. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped like a Cooper's compass, 2 narrow legs meeting beneath a round hinge. Beneath the key was a tintype from 1903. A young woman stood outside the cooperage holding a draw knife across her apron. Her face had Hazel's narrow chin, Hazel's heavy eyelids, and the same uncertain set of the mouth that appeared whenever a camera required stillness. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Ruth Mercer, daughter of Silas, age 25, summer of 1903. Hazel placed the tintype beside Amos's letter. The key remained on the mantel. No lock in the building accepted it, and she did not force the question. By March, snow withdrew from the north wall in narrow strips. Beargrass Creek grew loud enough to hear through closed windows, and walnut catkins hung above the lane like loose green cords. Hazel cleaned the cooper's tools, sharpened one draw knife, and studied Amos's notebook each evening. She did not begin a full barrel that spring. The billets in the workroom had waited decades. Another season would not diminish them. She chose 1 silver coin from the cash and exchanged it for white oak offcuts, a small iron hoop, and enough fuel for careful tests. She practiced splitting along the ray, hollowing short staves, and holding heat without scorching the edge. Most samples failed. She marked each one with the date and reason. The house was patient. So was she? 2 winters later, in December 2024, Hazel completed her first tight-coopered barrel. It was small enough to rest across both forearms and held only 5 gallons. She had split every stave by hand, rejected 7 for wandering grain, and shaped the remaining pieces against the jointer plane until no daylight showed between them. She warmed the shell gradually, tightened the truss hoops by half turns, and held the toast between 394 and 403 degrees for 12 minutes. The final char lasted 40 seconds. When the barrel cooled, she filled it with water and placed it on clean paper. No dark line appeared. Hazel waited through the night before touching it. At dawn, she found the paper dry and struck the upper hoop once with Amos's hammer. The sound travelled through the restored room, clear and exact. The Cooperage no longer smelled of rot. White pine floors reflected the stove light. The repaired plaster carried small irregularities that revealed the oak lath beneath. Tools hung in measured spaces over the bench, and the original wavering window preserved the walnuts in old glass. Hazel had kept the giant display barrel where she found it, though its false compartment now stood empty. The brass key remained unresolved until the following spring. On April 6th, Hazel was pruning a dead limb from the oldest walnut tree when her saw exposed a rectangle of green metal beneath a fold of bark. She stopped cutting and cleared the moss with the back of her glove. A brass plate had been set into the trunk before the tree closed around it. At its center was a keyhole shaped like the narrow point of a compass. The cellar key entered without resistance. Behind the plate lay a shallow copper box sealed with waxed cloth. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag, its blue field softened to grey at the creases, and a note written by Ruth Mercer in October 1918, while Thomas was serving in France. She wrote that the influenza had closed churches, schools and half the shops in Louisville. Orders had stopped, but she continued shaping barrel heads each morning because Thomas had asked her to keep the yard ready for his return. She described placing the flag in the walnut so that, if he came home, they could hang it above the shop. If he did not, someone else might one day understand that waiting was also a form of work. Thomas never saw the flag. Hazel aired it flat between sheets of unbleached cotton and took the note to the county archive for preservation. She did not place either item on public display. The flag returned to the copper box, protected from damp, and the brass plate closed beneath the living bark. On November 11, 2025, Hazel carried Thomas's Victory Medal to Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville. A records clerk had helped her locate the family memorial entry, though Thomas himself remained buried overseas. At 11 in the morning, she laid the medal beneath the name inscribed on the stone and stood through the minute of silence. Before leaving, she wrapped it again and brought it home. The money remained mostly untouched. Hazel spent $3 silver, one for her first oak samples, one toward the chimney materials, and one to replace the Cooperage's broken hand pump. She used 2 mercury dimes to buy linen thread for rebinding Amos's notebook. Every other note and coin went back into the tin box. She wrote a new label in black ink. For the next one, who will do the work? The box returned to the zinc tube beneath the giant barrel. Hazel sealed the cedar disc but left the compass mark clean enough to find. In her own ledger, she recorded the amount, the location, and every coin she had removed. The shop reopened without a newspaper notice. Doris allowed Hazel 1 index card on the Blue Hen Cafe corkboard. It read, hand-repaired barrels, small kegs, oak vessels, inquiries by mail, Mercer Cooperage, Cooper Lane. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then a beekeeper asked for a watertight honey keg. A retired distiller brought in a cracked display barrel. A church ordered a small baptismal vessel, plain and unvarnished. By summer, Hazel kept a mailing list of 43 names in a school notebook, though she accepted only the work she could complete without haste. Caleb returned after finishing high school. He arrived in Frank's pickup with sawdust in his hair and a long object wrapped in a horse blanket. When he uncovered it, Hazel saw a hand-carved walnut sign. The letters followed the old proportions of Varden-tight Coopers, but the new wording read, Mercer Coopers and Daughters. Hazel looked at the final 2 words. I'm not anybody's daughter here, she said. Caleb leaned the sign against the bench. Ruth was. They hung it above the doors that afternoon. The phrase remained larger than either of them. It honored Ruth, Hazel, and whoever might someday arrive without proof that they belonged. Caleb began sweeping on Saturdays, then learned to sharpen tools, then ruined 6 staves by cutting against the ray. Hazel made him mark each failure and keep it. In January 2026, she opened a fresh sheet of cream paper. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote the date, the location of the notebook, and the names of the people who had kept the Cooperage alive without owning any part of it. She described the pump leather, the chimney mixture, the hidden walnut plate, and the correct way to listen for a dead note in iron. She did not write that endurance made a person noble. She wrote that work had to be checked in daylight. At the bottom, she added one instruction of her own: do not begin with the barrel. Begin by making the room dry enough to protect the wood. She folded the letter along 3 exact creases and placed it beneath Amos's. Some things look like small gestures and turn out to be everything. That evening, Hazel closed the shutters, banked the stove, and walked to the lane. The new sign moved slightly in the winter wind. Behind her, rows of staves rested beneath canvas, shaped but not yet heated. A lamp remained lit above the bench for anyone coming late. The wooden barrel maker's cooperage waits. It has always waited. In Ashby Cross, Mrs. Harlow still worked 2 mornings a week at the clerk's office. The original dollar remained in the narrow centre drawer of her desk, pressed beneath the carbon copy of Hazel's deed. Its edge had curled with age, but she never spent it. Whenever someone asked why it was there, she closed the drawer and said only that $4 had once been enough.